Professor Norman Fenton, everybody, been with us before, phenomenally so, tackling the unvaccinated program and the misinformation that surrounded that. And but today, Norman is here to tackle more misinformation with me. And a great deal of it surrounds the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan. Sadiq Khan is, well, he calls himself London's first Green Mayor. He's a major pusher of net zero by 2030. He's proud of introducing electric buses and soon tubes to London. He makes a lot of astounding claims, Norman, right? Yeah. Tell us some of his claims that he makes on Twitter.
Well, the funniest one was this recent one, I think last week. He said that as a result of our junk food ad ban on Transport for London, nearly 100,000 cases of obesity have been prevented, and it's expected to save the National Health Service over £200 million. Incredible result. So that's his tweet. And of course, because he's got this sort of privileged position and his narrative fits in with the sort of the elite's narrative, he doesn't really get challenged. He only gets challenged by a minority. And it turns out that this claim that he's made there is based on absolutely one of the worst examples of poor mathematical modeling that you can imagine. I actually looked at the study that it was based on. It's actually almost laughable when you actually look at the detail. So first of all, context. This ad ban on junk food was introduced in February 2019 on Transport for London. So what did this study do? It compared the buying habits of not even 1,000, it was actually less than 1,000 Londoners since then, to the buying habits of 1,000 Northerners. I mean, you couldn't make this stuff up. And what they did, was they looked at the calorie counts in the food that the Londoners were buying compared to this sample of Northerners. And what they found was that on average, the food the Londoners bought had a lower calorie count. So what they did was then they used this crude mathematical model that predicted actually less than 100,000, 95,000 would be prevented from getting obesity simply based on this ludicrous model of a reduction in calorie count, not ignoring all the stuff about, maybe Northerners have a different diet anyway, and Londoners, why would their calorie count, what they're buying, how do you know that those people have been influenced by the advert? Here's do you want to know the reason why it's absolutely a joke study?
100%.
All you got to do is look at the actual child obesity rates. And it's incredible. It turns out the child obesity rates have increased in London faster than average since the start of the ban. The real evidence shows that obesity has actually got worse, not better. And of course, that's not a reason. I mean, of course, the ban is irrelevant. It's just there's no evidence of any impact whatsoever.
Right.
It's laughable. Fun enough.
But it's not just any old tweeter. This is the Mayor of London. And it's still up. That tweet is still up. And I find it extraordinary that Twitter doesn't, correct him for misinformation. It seems really unfair, doesn't it? It
is. Although, to be fair, I think there is something amusing about it, because I think this was the one I responded to. And I think my reply has got as many likes as his original tweet.
I've got it here. Curious that this kind of genuine misinformation is allowed to go unchallenged by the Twitter censors, but real data and stories about vax injuries either get a Twitter warning or are banned outright. Sadiq Khan is one of the politically correct elite allowed to spout nonsense.
Exactly, and that's it. He's not challenged on it. So, you won't get the fact check. I mean, the interest is I haven't checked. Have the fact checkers looked at this one?
No, but I tell you what, the actual article that he was pushing, because he did several tweets. Back in 2019, I took the controversial but necessary decision to introduce a junk food ban. That article that he was tweeting has actually been corrected. And it's extraordinary that it is horrendous, because, that he's allowed to do that, because it's so incredibly misleading. It's not just a bit misleading, it's incredibly misleading. But that's not the only one. His big thing is obviously ULEZ, which is the whole idea of, net zero carbon emissions. He's expanding it further and further out to Greater London, making it harder and harder for people, so that driving in London really is only for the wealthy or people who can afford electric cars. And he's made some astonishing claims about that, how that's saving lives as well.
This is the thing. All of these types of studies, including the studies which support the net zero policy and all that, are based on similarly flawed mathematical models. I mean, another very good example, I'm not sure if Sadiq Khan has actually claimed it, but very similar, is this one that big news, the claim that 20 million lives were saved worldwide because of the COVID vaccines. I mean, that one's incredible. So I looked at that one as well. And in fact, so this was a study published in The Lancet. And of course, what do we find? It's the Imperial group, although Neil Ferguson's name's not on it. It's the Imperial team with their ludicrous modelling, right? In fact, they even claim for the UK that it's saved between 400,000 and over 1 million lives. And the problem is, again, it's based on this flawed mathematical modelling. Let's think about what happened. That their models massively, their projections of COVID deaths right from the beginning were massively exaggerating the number of the actual number of COVID deaths right from the beginning. They were using that as a justification for lockdown. Well, they're doubling down, basically saying those projections were correct. What they're doing is they're assuming that the projection of deaths on COVID without the intervention of lockdowns and vaccines would really have gone on like that exponentially on their way up. And so you know what these numbers are based on? All they do then is that their estimate of the lives saved is simply based on comparing their projected, the model, the predictions based on their projections, comparing it with the actual observed deaths. Unbelievable. Look.
I find that astonishing.
It is astonishing.
Let me just get this correct. They created these figures in the beginning, which they appeared to pull out of thin air, and it was absolutely ramped up, the whole lockdown issue and all of the measures there. And then they made a comparison with their own dodgy figures to say that we've saved all these lives. That's what you're just telling me.
Yeah, they're just comparing their predictions with the actual observed lives and saying, well, then it's the vaccines which have saved all those lives.
That's extraordinary.
And again, you don't have to understand the mathematics or anything like that to know that there's a problem with this, because all you've got to look at is compare the actual data on COVID deaths in areas which have got the mass vaccination program and those that haven't. And of course, you don't get there's no sort of correlation. We know that, for example, countries which have the lowest vaccination rates, for example, in Africa, have had almost zero COVID deaths. So, well, how are their lives saved?
Right.
And similarly, the most vaccinated countries have seen their COVID death rates increase. So you just have to look at the real world data and not the models to realize how ridiculous these claims based on these models actually are.
I find it extraordinary. I was saying this to Ros in regard to, medics. I do find it extraordinary that people within those systems, there's so few that are kind of like, standing up against it. You are quite a lone voice in terms of mathematics and modelling and looking at that. And we've talked about the problems that you've had regarding that, because it's always quite difficult. But how do you feel when you look at these other people who are modeling?
I'm ashamed of my profession, the academic profession, because I think that this type of modeling is going to do long-term damage to the credibility of mathematics. I mean, mathematics is sort of the purest of of the sciences. Nobody questions kind of like mathematics, but since the start of this crisis and not just since this, I mean, also in things like, as you mentioned, sort of the claims made for ULEZ and all the claims made for sort of carbon net zero, all of those claims based on also flawed mathematical modelling with exaggerated projections. I think this is discrediting the noble science, some call it the art of mathematics, and will do long-term damage. And the tragedy is that there are plenty of mathematicians and statisticians who surely must be aware of how ludicrous this is, but won't speak up because nobody wants to be seen to be, challenging people like Sadiq Khan, because he's one of the people you can't criticize. And as soon as anybody starts criticizing a Lancet study, which is predicting that vaccines have saved all these COVID deaths, then they're going to get exactly the kind of flack that I've been receiving.
Exactly.
That's an area you can't go to.
How would you suggest that we can be more discerning about
this?
Just
find out if they say they should be asked if it's based on a model or if it's based on real data. That's the key thing. That's the difference. This is the point. I feel the reason why I'm particularly upset about this, because what we do, our work, is a type of it's mathematical modelling as well.
Right.
And so our work gets tarred with the same brush. People who actually understand why this type of modelling with these ridiculous projections is used. That comes back on us. We get the blowback on that. Whereas our work, it's based on data and knowledge. And we take full account of uncertainty. We wouldn't make these kinds of predictions without making clear what the full uncertainty associated with it is and what the assumptions it was based on. And they don't make, if you see a report and it doesn't tell you what the assumptions are and whether it was based on a model or real world data, then you need to be suspicious. You need to realize that it's probably massively hyped up.
Ray says statistics will tell you anything you pay for. And we know that some of these people are incredibly compromised, aren't they?
Yes, yeah, they are, yeah.